Hi, welcome back. Here's the next little mini lecture from chapter 1, just covering a small question, big question. It's a pretty big question. What is life? What does it mean to be a living thing? So I'm going to go through some of the characteristics that scientists have agreed upon, that if you are a living thing, you need to have these characteristics. And then a couple slides on how we classify living things. How do we make the determination that you are a bear versus a monkey, right? All right, so let's get started. So how do we know something is alive? So there's a list of characteristics in your text that we're going to go through with some pictures, and I'll go through some quick explanations. So the first thing, for you to be considered living, you have to be made of cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life. If you do not are comprised of at least one cell, you are not a living thing. So organelles, like a nucleus or a mitochondria, they are within cells, but they themselves are too small. They do not carry all of the characteristics of something being alive. A virus, viruses are not living things. They're not composed of cells. Energy is not alive. Fire is not alive. It is not made of cells. So the cell is a basic unit of life. We'll be seeing this more when we get into chapter 4. So this is our number one big rule. You have to be made up of at least one cell. There's a lot of organisms that are just single-celled, and there's a lot of organisms that are what we call multicellular. They're made up of many, many, many cells. Number 2 is organisms grow and develop. So this is showing a little baby alligator. It's not always going to stay a little baby alligator. You started off as a fertilized egg. You are no longer a fertilized egg. You are a multi-trillion cell organism. So living things grow and develop. This jackrabbit picture, this is the picture representing a word we call homeostasis. So homeo means same, stasis means same. So homeostasis means same. Basically, the takeaway message from that is organisms need to be able to maintain a constant internal environment no matter what's going on outside. It's so very important to keep the chemical reactions and metabolic reactions of life going, and to do that, organisms have to maintain stable internal environments. So I use the jackrabbit as an example because it's showing really well its really big ears and all of the vasculature, the blood vessels you can actually see in that picture. So this goes back to one of our themes of structure and function, right? So if you're a jackrabbit living out in a shrub brush environment, it's going to be pretty warm. And you're covered in fur, you probably don't have sweat glands. And so you need a way to cool your body down, because if your body temperature gets too high, your cells aren't going to function properly. So if you have these big, thin ears that you can put a lot of blood into, as the air is rushing past, as you're hopping through the bushes, that cool air will take some of that heat away, and then you will recirculate the cooler blood back into your core. It's the same thing for, like, elephants have those big flappy ears that are very vascular, that helps them regulate their body temperature. We have a lot of surface area on our skin. We have sweat glands. When we get hot, we sweat. That our blood vessels close to the surface vasodilate, and so our warm blood goes to the surface. The sweat, as it's evaporating, takes the heat away, and that helps us maintain our constant body temperature. And that's just one example of all of the things that organisms have to do to maintain life, to keep on living. Just regulating body temperature, regulating sugar concentrations, regulating calcium or other ions, or your pH inside of your cell. So all of those things have to be maintained, and this is collectively a term that we call homeostasis. We'll be seeing that a lot more, especially if you go on into the anatomy and physiology courses. All right, the next characteristic of living thing is responding to stimuli. So here, the example that I give you is a Venus's flytrap trapping a damselfly. So this is a very special mechanism that plant has the ability to close its trap very quickly when a couple of these little sensor barbs inside this modified leaf have been touched or irritated in some way. It will close on to that insect, and it will start digesting the insect for the nitrogen, not the sugar, because it can do photosynthesis, it's green. So that's one modification for that particular organism to respond to the environment. But we do the same thing, kind of like with our jackrabbit example. When we are hot, we respond to that stimuli by cooling our body down. If we get cold, we respond to that stimuli by vasoconstricting, keeping the blood close into our core, maybe doing goosebumps as a vestigial response when we had a lot of hair on our bodies. So we have to respond to stimuli. All living things have to respond to their environment and to internal stimuli as well as external stimuli. The cute picture of the penguin and the baby, this is to illustrate the living characteristic of reproduction. So all living things have to be able to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. Some organisms do it sexually, where usually a male and a female come together, they share genetic information and produce a genetically unique offspring. There are some organisms like bacteria and protists that reproduce asexually, where they just copy their DNA and make clones, basically. But all living things have to be able to make copies of themselves, which is what we call reproduction. And then the last major or characteristic of something living is populations of living things have to change over time, this ability to adapt to your environment. So I have the picture of this little cute seahorse that's blending in very nicely with a coral environment around it. So maybe there was some time back in the biological history of this little seahorse where it wasn't always pink or it didn't always have bumps, but mutations may have occurred in the gene pool of that population, and the ones that allowed them to look more like their environment, which made them camouflaged and protected from any predators, those are the ones that survived and passed those traits on to their offspring. And so this is this idea of natural selection, populations changing over time. If you don't do that, if you cannot adapt and have the ability to change over time, you're not going to survive. You will become extinct because you cannot adapt to your changing environment. All right, so those are the characteristics of living things. You have to be made of cells, you have to grow and develop, you have to maintain homeostasis, you have to respond to stimuli, you have to reproduce, and you have to be able to evolve over time. 6 characteristics of living things. All right, so the next couple of slides are dealing with what we call classification. Oh, sorry, I forgot biological organization. So biological organization is just a way that we can put things in order based on their level of complexity, if you will. So all living things start off as basically, well, let me back up. All things are made of atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter that have the characteristics of matter. Anything that has mass and takes up space. So atoms, so if I'll get my little pen here. This is a water molecule, which is made up of 3 atoms, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. And they come together to make molecules. And molecules, smaller molecules, come together to make larger molecules. So we're going to call this first level the chemical level. Right? If you have ever taken a chemistry class, we're going to be learning a little bit more about chemistry in chapters 2 and 3. This is how far you go. You just focus on chemistry, the relationships between atoms, the bonding, the chemical reactions that are happening at the chemical level. But once you start building those chemicals into these large macromolecules and you put those together in a very special way, we have what's called the cellular level. So again, this is the smallest level at which we can have life, right? That was our first characteristic of living things. So cells are just a big sack of chemicals, but they are put together in a very special way that allows a cell to carry on all of those characteristics of life. Then if you have multiple cells doing similar functions kind of collected together, this is what we call a tissue. And multiple tissues coming together produce what we call an organ. So in this case, we're following bones. So a bone cell, a whole bunch of bone cells come together to make the tissue of bone tissue. Multiple tissues come together like cartilage and bone and blood and fat come together to make the organ. Multiple organs come together to make the organ system, in this case, a skeletal system, which is the cardiovascular system and the skeletal system and the digestive system. Those are examples of the system level. And then all of those systems come together to make an organism. So for our class, by 211, we are just going to really be doing these first 2 levels. We're going to spend a couple chapters on chemistry, that's chapters 2 and 3, and then everything else, we're just going to dive into the cellular level. What's going on inside of a cell? What is a cell? What are cell processes? Like generating energy in the mitochondria, replicating the cell with mitosis and meiosis. How do we make proteins? The information that's coded for in DNA, how is that getting expressed? So this is going to be our Bi 211 topics: chemistry, basic chemistry, and cell biology. If you were to continue on with the sequence of 212 and 213, say you're going to transfer as a biology major, you will learn the rest of these organizations in those classes. If you're moving on into the anatomy physiology sequence, you will then spend a whole year talking about all of the tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms that are unique to just humans. So what we're learning in Bi 211 is the precursor to understanding. It's the foundation to understanding wherever you're going on to next, whether you're going to go off into the sciences and be a biology major, or you're going off into healthcare and being a nurse or a paramedic, or whatever your allied health journey is. If you're continuing into the biology track, this is where you're going to see the rest of this biological organization is in when you get a whole bunch of the same organisms together. We call that a population. So a population of African elephants, a population of humans, a population of cats, a population of bacteria of the same species. So that's a population, a collection of organisms that are of the same species. Then if you get some biological systems interact, one of our first themes in our first mini lesson. So in this community, you have elephants, you have giraffes, you have trees and grasses, and it looks like a little antelope. So those are multiple populations living together in a community, okay? Then when you go to the ecosystem level, you take all those living things and then you put in the non-living environment. So the sunlight, the temperature, the soil, the water, the pH, the humidity, the things that are abiotic, that are not living things, combined with all of the communities in a particular area, this is what we call an ecosystem. So in this case, an ecosystem looks like it's on an African savanna, but we have the Amazon rainforest or the African rainforest, or our temperate rainforests like over in Crescent City and the redwoods, or you might have a tundra or a desert like the Sahara. So those are all different examples of ecosystems. And when you put all of those different ecosystems together, you get our last level of biological organization, which is our biosphere. As far as we know, this is the only one. This is all we have. And so as you can see, this progression of biological organization starts from the smallest bit, which are the atoms and molecules, this chemical level, all the way to the huge planet that we have. And they all interact, right? That's all we have. Okay, these last two slides are dealing with the diversity of life and the classification of life. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's just more of making sure you understand the groupings that organisms are in. I'm not going to ask you to classify, here's an organism and name all of its hierarchy, but you should be comfortable with the sequence. So the largest group is a domain, and the next slide will talk about what the domains are. And then we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So they've given you in this pictorial representation of the chimpanzee and how it starts with everything else that's of the domain Eukarya. And as you get more specific to the details, you can kind of exclude other organisms that don't share that characteristic that you're focusing on. So you should be able to list those in order: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I highlighted subphylum because we don't need to know that one. Just skip over that one. One of the ways that I remember this is a mnemonic. It goes: dumb kings play cards on fine green sofas. You may have heard another one if you've had a biology class in the past, but somehow you need to remember that sequence. All right, and this last slide is just grouping into our largest grouping, the domain. So there's currently known 3 domains of living things. We have 2 single-celled prokaryotic domains and 1 larger eukaryotic domain, and that's actually the name of our largest domain that we fit into, is called domain eukarya. When we get into chapter 4 and we talk about cells, one of the defining features of 2 groups of cells is whether they have a nucleus or not. Eukarya, so these organisms here in the domain eukarya, they are all cells that contain a nucleus, right? So the nucleus is that dark staining middle part. It has all the DNA in it. So this would be an example of a eukaryotic cell. So if you are a cell with a nucleus, you fit into this domain eukarya. If you are a bacteria or an archaea, you might be a little bacillus like this. You might be some little coccus like this, little circles. So these are examples of prokaryotic cells, and they do not have a nucleus. They still have DNA, but it's not membrane bound. And there's some other features we'll see in chapter 4. So our 3 domains are bacteria, which is a prokaryotic cell, archaea, which are also prokaryotic cells, and eukarya, which are made up of eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus and organelles and things like that. Within the domain eukarya, the 4 major kingdoms, right, domains, kingdoms, we have plants, animals, fungi, and protists. We fit into the animal kingdom, so we are of the kingdom Animalia, and I'm not going to go much more into the taxonomy and classification of living things, so you should be comfortable with your Dumb King's Play cards on fine green sofas, the sequence of that, and be comfortable with your 3 domains and what kind of classifies them. So your domain eukarya is due to a nucleated cell. Archaea and bacteria are no nucleus cells. These are prokaryotic cells. All right, so that wraps up this little mini lesson on what is life and how we classify life, and I will see you next time.